A pattern, written in stone. Every species alive today will, one day, disappear. That is not a warning. It is not a prophecy. It is simply the oldest rule life on this planet has ever been forced to follow. In 4.5 billion years, Earth has built empire after empire of living things. Oceans once teemed with creatures no human eye has ever seen. Skies once belonged to wings older than imagination itself. Forests once grew taller and stranger and stronger than anything that stands today. And 5 times, without warning, without mercy, and without exception, almost all of it was taken away. Scientists call them the Big Five. 5 mass extinctions, scattered across hundreds of millions of years, each one a different kind of apocalypse. A fire from below the crust, a poison carried quietly downstream, a cold that refused to end, a rock that fell out of a clear morning sky, and one catastrophe so complete, so absolute, so far beyond anything before or since, that paleontologists still refer to it by a single, chilling name: the Great Dying. Today, we count them down. Not by date, not by fame, but by the only measurement that has ever truly mattered in the story of life on Earth: severity. How much of everything alive, across land, sea, and sky, was permanently erased. We begin at number 5, and we will not stop until we reach the single worst day this planet has ever survived. And as we move through each of these 5 catastrophes, listen closely, because in every one of these stories, the Earth gave a warning first. Slowly, quietly, sometimes over the space of a single violent afternoon, and sometimes across hundreds of thousands of years. And in every single case, life did not fully understand what was happening until there was no longer any time left to respond. Let us begin the countdown. Part 2. Number 5. The Late Devonian Extinction, or the age the reefs fell silent. 372 million years ago, long before dinosaurs, long before mammals, long before anything walked upon dry land with any real sense of purpose, the oceans of Earth were the single most extraordinary place life had ever managed to build. This was the Devonian period, and the seas, without question, belonged to fish. Not the small, familiar fish that dart through a modern aquarium, but armored giants, plated in bone so thick it functioned like a suit of natural armor. Jaws capable of shearing through the toughest shells without ever slowing down. One of them, a creature called Dunkleosteus, grew longer than a city bus, its bite among the most powerful ever measured in the history of vertebrate life. Beneath the waves, reefs stretched for hundreds of miles, built not from the coral we recognize today, but from ancient sponges and calcifying organisms that had spent tens of millions of patient years learning how to construct entire cities out of stone. And on the very edges of this world, something even stranger was beginning to happen. Plants, having only recently discovered how to survive outside of water, were climbing onto land for the first time in the history of the Earth. Their roots dug deeper into the soil than any living thing had ever dared before. Forests, real forests, with real height and real shade and real permanence, were rising across the continents for the very first time. It must have felt, if anything alive back then could have felt such a thing, like the beginning of something extraordinary. A new frontier opening all at once. It was, in fact, the quiet beginning of a disaster. Because those same roots, breaking apart stone that had never once been disturbed, released a flood of nutrients that had been locked away since the beginning of time. Rain carried them into rivers. Rivers carried them out to sea, in quantities the ocean had never once been asked to absorb. At first, the ocean responded exactly the way you might expect life to respond to abundance. It bloomed, algae multiplied by the trillion, turning vast stretches of open water into thick, suffocating mats of sudden, explosive, uncontrolled growth. Then, as all of that new life began to die and rot and sink toward the seafloor, it did something far more dangerous than simply disappearing. It consumed the water's oxygen. Not in one isolated bay, not in a single corner of a single continent. Across entire ocean basins, region by region, deeper water first, and then the shallows soon after, until creatures that had thrived in these waters for tens of millions of years found themselves suddenly trapped inside a sea that could no longer sustain them. Try for a moment to imagine an ocean slowly losing its ability to let anything breathe. Not all at once, in a single violent night, but gradually, relentlessly, spreading outward like a stain that never stops growing. The great reefs, the underwater cities that had taken tens of millions of years to construct, one shell, one skeleton, one small colony at a time, began to die. Not in a single catastrophic afternoon, but across hundreds of thousands of years, in a slow, grinding, almost invisible collapse that nothing alive at the time could possibly have understood as it was happening. By the time it was finally over, an estimated 75% of every species on Earth was gone. The reefs, once the most productive ecosystems the ocean had ever known, would not fully recover for another 100 million years. There was no asteroid this time, no fire raining down from the sky, no single dramatic moment anyone could point to and say, "Here, this is exactly when it began." There were only roots and rain and rivers, carrying an invisible poison downstream to a sea that had no possible way of refusing it. If that sounds strange to you, sounds almost too quiet, too slow, to belong on a list of the deadliest events in the entire history of life, then consider this. Somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico, right now, at this exact moment, there is a stretch of ocean larger than the entire state of Connecticut, where almost nothing can survive. It grows every single summer, fed by fertilizer and agricultural runoff carried down the Mississippi River from farmland more than 1,000 miles inland. It grows the same way, year after year, quietly, invisibly, beneath the surface, where almost no one ever thinks to look. And across coral reefs around the entire world, the same ancient story is unfolding again on a far larger stage. Not the ancient reefs of stone and sponge that vanished 372 million years ago, but their living descendants, bleaching pale and dying in warming seas at a rate never once recorded in the whole of human history. The Devonian extinction did not need a villain. It only needed chemistry and time and a world too slow, too distracted, too confident in its own permanence to notice exactly what it was quietly doing to itself. That is our number 5. Number 4, the Triassic Extinction, or the day the continent broke. Move forward now, more than 150 million years, into a world almost unrecognizable from the one we just left behind. By 201 million years ago, nearly all of Earth's land had gathered itself into a single, vast supercontinent. Geologists call it Pangaea, and for tens of millions of years, it had existed exactly as its name suggests. Whole, unified. One single, enormous landmass stretching from pole to pole. But nothing in this world stays whole forever. Deep beneath the surface, forces that had been quietly building pressure for millions upon millions of years were finally, inevitably, ready to tear that unity apart. Pangaea was cracking, and when a supercontinent begins to break, it does not do so gently, or quietly, or with any particular concern for the life clinging to its surface. Along the seams where the land was splitting apart, in what would one day tens of millions of years later, become the edges of the Atlantic Ocean. The Earth's crust opened like a wound that refused to close. Molten rock, held under pressure almost beyond calculation for millions of years, finally found its way to the surface. Not from a single volcano, the way we might picture an eruption today, but from thousands of individual fissures, spread across an area larger than the entire modern United States combined. This eruption did not last for a single day, or even a single year. It arrived in pulses, stretched across hundreds of thousands of years, each new wave burying the landscape beneath fresh sheets of lava, while pouring an almost unimaginable volume of gas directly into the sky above. The sky changed first. Carbon dioxide, trapped in the atmosphere in concentrations the world had genuinely never experienced before, began to hold the sun's heat far too close to the surface. Global temperatures climbed, and simply did not stop climbing. Meanwhile, that same gas, dissolving steadily into the world's oceans, began altering the very chemistry of seawater itself, turning it slowly, steadily corrosive to anything that had ever built its home from a shell. On land, the giant amphibians and the heavily armored, crocodile-like reptiles that had ruled the world for tens of millions of years began to vanish, one lineage after another, unable to survive inside a climate that no longer resembled anything they had spent millions of years evolving for. In the oceans, entire families of shelled creatures simply dissolved out of existence, unable to keep pace with water that had, in a geological instant, turned against them. An estimated 80% of every species on the planet disappeared. But here is the strange, quiet twist hidden inside almost every extinction story ever recorded in the rock. When the old rulers finally vanish, someone, somewhere, is always waiting patiently in the wings. Small, easily overlooked, built for endurance rather than for dominance. In the sudden empty spaces left behind, a group of modest, two-legged reptiles that had spent millions of years living quietly in the shadow of far larger creatures, suddenly found room, for the very first time, to grow. We call them dinosaurs. Without this specific extinction, without this precise, continent-splitting catastrophe, they may never have risen at all. The empire that would go on to rule the Earth for the next 135 million years was born directly out of one of the deadliest events in the planet's entire history. Now, step back into the present for just a moment. We are not causing a supercontinent to physically tear itself apart, but we are running, in miniature, an eerily similar chemical experiment. Where those ancient eruptions released their carbon across tens of thousands of patient years, human industry has released a comparable share of it in under 2 centuries. That is not slow. That is not gradual. That is, geologically speaking, almost instantaneous. The oceans today are measurably more acidic than they were before industrialization began, and the creatures most at risk from that shift, the shelled organisms, the plankton sitting quietly at the base of the entire marine food chain, are the very same category of life that nearly vanished 201 million years ago. We did not need a rift to open beneath our feet. We built our own, spread across every smokestack, every engine, every power plant on the entire planet, and, quite literally, we lit it ourselves. That is our number 4. Number 3, the Ordovician Silurian Extinction, or the world that froze, then forgot how to stop. 444 million years ago, life on Earth was, in almost every sense, still a story that belonged entirely to the sea. Nearly everything that lived underwater. Trilobites, armored and strange, and utterly unlike anything alive today, crawled patiently across ocean floors that stretched wide and shallow around the edges of every continent. Ancient relatives of the modern squid drifted through warm, sunlit currents. the very first true fish were only just beginning to appear. Small, unremarkable, easily overlooked, in waters otherwise ruled by creatures with far stranger names and far stranger shapes than anything a modern eye would recognize. This entire world depended, almost completely, on its shallow seas. Vast underwater shelves, sunlit and warm, wrapping gently around the edges of every landmass, giving nearly all marine life on Earth somewhere to live, to feed, to breed, to simply exist. Then, far to the south, on a supercontinent scientists call Gondwana, the world began, quite suddenly, to freeze. An ice age arrived with startling, almost violent speed, locking enormous volumes of the planet's water away inside rapidly growing ice sheets. And as that water disappeared into ice, sea levels around the entire globe began, steadily, to fall. Picture for a moment an aquarium being slowly drained. Not all at once, in one dramatic instant, but steadily, relentlessly, as the very water that had sustained an entire world of life simply ceased, bit by bit, to be there anymore. The shallow seas that so much of Earth's life depended upon began to vanish entirely. Habitats that had existed, stable and unchanged, for millions of years disappeared as the water retreated, taking countless species down with them into extinction. And then, just as the survivors were finally beginning to adjust to the cold, to the shrinking seas, to a world that had turned suddenly and unexpectedly harsh, everything reversed. The ice melted. Sea levels rose again, and rose rapidly. But the returning water carried with it a second, hidden danger, one far less visible than the first. As the oceans warmed once more, they lost their ability to hold on to oxygen, and the very creatures that had only just barely endured the freeze now found themselves suffocating, slowly, inside the same water that was supposed to be bringing them home. Two catastrophes, arriving back to back, nested inside a single unfolding crisis. An estimated 85% of every species on Earth vanished, caught inside a disaster that struck not once, but twice, before life had ever been given a real chance to recover its footing in between. We tend to imagine climate catastrophe as something that only ever moves in a single direction, the world simply growing hotter and hotter, forever, without end. But this particular ancient story tells us something considerably more unsettling. It was not only the cold that killed, it was the whiplash. The sheer speed of the reversal, faster than any living thing could possibly hope to adapt to in time. Today, ice sheets across West Antarctica and Greenland are melting at a pace that accelerates a little further with each passing year, threatening the exact same kind of sea level rise that once drowned ancient coastlines and drove ancient species directly into extinction. And climate scientists studying Earth's own ancient ice ages have found the same unsettling warning written permanently into the rock. It is rarely the direction of change that life truly cannot survive. It is almost always the speed. We are pushing our planet's thermostat hard and fast in one single direction, and history has already shown us, more than once, what tends to happen when the rebound finally inevitably arrives. That is our number 3. Number 2, the Cretaceous Paleogene Extinction, or the day the sky caught fire. You already know this story, even if you have never once heard its proper name. 66 million years ago, the Earth was a paradise that had absolutely no idea it was about to lose everything. Forests of towering conifers and newly evolved, brilliantly blooming flowers stretched unbroken across every continent on the planet. Herds of enormous, plant-eating dinosaurs moved together across open plains, some weighing more than a modern elephant, others standing as tall as a 2-story house. Predators, patient, and enormous and perfectly adapted, waited quietly in the shadows of ancient trees. Overhead, pterosaurs with wingspans wider than a small aircraft rode the rising wind above oceans, filled with marine reptiles, ancient sharks, and countless spiral-shelled creatures called ammonites, drifting by the millions through warm, sunlit currents. Nothing about that particular morning felt like the beginning of an ending. Far above the clouds, far beyond anything any living creature on Earth could possibly see or sense, an asteroid roughly 10 kilometers wide, close to 6 miles across, was quietly completing a journey that had taken millions of years to unfold. It had never been aimed at Earth specifically. It had simply been obeying gravity, patiently drifting through the solar system for longer than most species alive at the time had even existed, until at last, its path and our planet's path finally unavoidably intersected. It struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in modern-day Mexico, traveling at more than 20 kilometers every single second, faster than 70,000 kilometers an hour. The energy released in that one single instant has been estimated at more than 1 billion times the power of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The ground did not simply shake, it vaporized. Solid rock, in an instant, began behaving like liquid. Earthquakes stronger than anything ever measured by modern human instruments rippled outward across the entire surface of the planet, and walls of ocean water, tsunamis hundreds of meters high, tore across coastlines thousands of miles away from the point of impact itself. But the true catastrophe, the one that would ultimately do the most damage, was only just beginning. Debris blasted high into the upper atmosphere began to spread steadily across the entire globe, and as it spread, it began to block the sun. Not for a single day, not even for a single week, for months, and by some scientific estimates, for years. Photosynthesis, the one process every food chain on Earth had always depended upon, slowed, and then, eventually, stopped completely. Forests that had stood tall and unbroken for millions of years could no longer grow. The herbivores that fed on them began to starve. The predators that fed on the herbivores soon followed them into starvation as well. In the oceans, the tiny organisms sitting at the very base of the marine food web collapsed in the sudden darkness, and everything living above them in that chain collapsed along with them. By the time the skies finally cleared, every single non-avian dinosaur on the planet was gone. An estimated 75% of all species vanished alongside them. Here is what should unsettle you most about this particular story, more than any other on our countdown today. This is the one extinction event on our entire list that we, right now, in this exact moment in history, actually possess the technology to prevent. The crater from that impact still exists, buried beneath the Yucatan Peninsula, more than 90 miles across. Space agencies today actively track thousands of asteroids that pass near our planet, and in the year 2022, a spacecraft deliberately collided with a small, distant asteroid called Dimorphos and successfully altered its path through space, proving, for the very first time in the entire history of our species, that a future impact might not have to end the way this one did. But there is a darker, quieter echo hidden inside this same story as well. Scientists studying the theoretical aftermath of large-scale nuclear conflict describe a mechanism strikingly, almost eerily similar to what ended the entire age of dinosaurs. Smoke and debris lifted high into the upper atmosphere, blocking out sunlight, collapsing agriculture across the globe, slowly starving whatever managed to survive the initial blast. Spread across nations around the entire world, humanity has, in its own arsenals, effectively built a version of the very asteroid that once fell from the sky, completely uninvited. The only real difference is this. This time, if it ever happens, there will be no distant rock drifting silently through space to blame. The choice, entirely, will be our own. That is our number 2. Number 1. the Permian Triassic Extinction, the Great Dying, and now, at last, we arrive at the single worst catastrophe life on this planet has ever endured. 252 million years ago, long before dinosaurs, long before the world had ever seen a single bird or a single flower, our planet was pushed to the very edge of complete and total biological collapse. Scientists studying this event have given it a name that needs absolutely no embellishment. They simply call it the Great Dying. In what is now modern-day Siberia, the Earth's crust opened in a way it had rarely, if ever, opened before or since. Enormous fissures spread across a region larger than the entire continent of Australia, releasing lava and gas in volumes that are almost impossible for the human mind to fully comprehend. This was not a single, contained eruption. This was a sustained, continuous volcanic catastrophe, one that may have lasted for hundreds of thousands of years without pause, releasing an amount of carbon dioxide, sulfur, and methane into Earth's atmosphere that dwarfed, by an enormous margin, every other eruption in this entire countdown combined. Global temperatures rose by an estimated 8 to 10 degrees. Oceans absorbed the excess carbon and, in response, turned steadily corrosive. As the water warmed further, it lost its ability to hold on to oxygen, and vast dead zones, not confined to a single region this time, but stretching across the entirety of the planet, spread silently and relentlessly across the seafloor. In the suffocating darkness of those oxygen-starved waters, certain bacteria bloomed uncontrollably and released toxic gas into the surrounding water and air. Gas that some scientists now believe may have damaged the very ozone layer meant to protect all life on Earth from the sun's radiation. Sea, land, air, all three systems failed, almost simultaneously, in a single chain reaction the Earth had never once before experienced, and, as far as we know, has never experienced again since. When it was finally, mercifully over, an estimated 96% of all marine species were gone. On land, roughly 70% of vertebrate life had vanished right alongside them. It would take an estimated 10 million years, an almost incomprehensible span of time, for life on Earth to even begin resembling anything close to what had been lost. This was not simply an extinction event. This was the closest that life on this entire planet has ever come to ending completely, permanently, and irreversibly. And here, finally, is the part of this story that should stay with you long after this video has ended. The very same region of the world, Siberia, is once again at the center of a distinctly modern warning. Beneath its frozen ground lies an enormous reserve of trapped carbon and methane, locked safely away inside permafrost that has remained solidly frozen for tens of thousands of years. But the Arctic today is warming nearly 4 times faster than the rest of the entire planet, and that same ancient frozen ground is now beginning, steadily, to thaw. Scientists have already documented strange, sudden craters violently appearing across the Siberian tundra, caused by pockets of built-up gas explosively escaping the melting earth beneath them, a quiet, eerie, unmistakable echo of the very same chemistry that once brought all life on this planet to the absolute edge of total extinction. We are not opening fissures the size of an entire continent, but we are running a smaller, quieter version of the very same experiment, releasing greenhouse gases into our atmosphere faster than our planet's natural systems were ever built to safely absorb, warming our oceans until they begin steadily losing oxygen and creating dead zones that, while admittedly not yet global in scale, are already spreading, quietly, steadily, across dozens of coastlines around the entire world. The Great Dying took hundreds of thousands of years to fully unfold, from its very first tremor to its final devastating collapse. We appear to be attempting something disturbingly similar in a matter of mere centuries. That is our number one, what the rock remembers. 5 extinctions. 5 entirely different weapons. Fire rising from deep below the Earth's crust. Fire falling suddenly from the open sky above. Ice that simply refused to release its grip. A slow, quiet suffocation carried gently downstream on ordinary rainfall. And finally, a catastrophe so complete, so total, so far beyond anything else in this entire countdown, that it very nearly ended the whole story of life itself, permanently. And yet, look closely at all 5 of these events together, and a single, unmistakable pattern begins to quietly emerge. It was never, in any single case, one isolated thing that ended a world. It was always, without exception, a chain. One change, however small and insignificant it may have first appeared, triggering the next change, and then the next, until the very systems that had sustained life for millions of stable, unbroken years simply could no longer keep pace with the speed of what was happening all around them. We are, right now, at this exact moment, the only species in the entire 4.5 billion-year history of this planet capable of actually watching that chain reaction unfold while it is still actively happening. And we may very well be the only species that has ever been given a genuine, meaningful chance to stop it, before that final, fatal link is allowed to fall into place. The Great Dying never received a warning of any kind. We did. The real question was never truly whether the Earth itself would somehow survive whatever comes next. It always has. Every single time, without exception, across 4.5 billion years. The only question that actually remains, the only one that matters now, is simply this: will we still be here to see it? Thank you for watching this episode of Echoes of Extinction. If this journey through the deepest, darkest history of our planet moved you, subscribe and join us again next time as we continue uncovering the forgotten chapters written quietly into the stone beneath our feet. Until then, remember always, every fossil tells a story, and every extinction, no matter how ancient, leaves behind an echo.